It started as a perfectly normal day. The mall was packed, the kind of day where you could hear the dull roar of chatter and laughter, where families and friends meandered through brightly lit stores. The mother held her son's hand tightly as they entered the children's clothing section, her mind already focused on the practical task ahead, finding him something nice for the upcoming family gathering. Her son, an energetic 8-year-old, beamed up at her, tugging at her sleeve to show her a shirt he liked. She smiled, ruffling his hair as they moved deeper into the store. Everything felt ordinary, comfortable even. But that was before she noticed him. Across the aisle, just beyond the rows of brightly colored children's outfits, stood a man. His presence was subtle at first, barely worth noticing among the crowd. But when her eyes met his, her breath caught. He wasn't shopping like the others, not casually browsing through the racks. He was simply watching. She turned back to her son, telling herself it was nothing, but that feeling of being observed, scrutinized, lingered. Minutes passed. The mother and her son continued their search for clothes, weaving between the racks. But no matter where they went, she felt it again, his eyes, heavy on her back. She resisted the urge to turn around, to confirm what she already knew. The man was following them. When she finally risked a glance over her shoulder, there he was. He stood unmoving a few racks away. His face was blank, as though devoid of any emotion. His eyes, dark and still, were locked on her and her son. Something about the way he looked at them made her skin prickle with unease. He didn't appear to be browsing. He wasn't holding any clothes. No, this man wasn't a shopper. He was something else. Something was off. Her motherly instinct screamed at her to leave the store, to take her son and run, but she suppressed the rising panic. It was probably nothing, just an odd man. They moved to a different section of the store, hoping to lose the stranger in the crowd, but no matter where they went, he was always there, lingering just on the edge of her vision. When she pretended to inspect a rack of clothes, she watched him from the corner of her eye. He didn't move fluidly like everyone else, instead seeming to glide from one spot to another, always stopping just far enough away to avoid direct confrontation, but always close enough for her to feel his unsettling presence. Her son, blissfully unaware, continued his playful chatter as he held up shirt after shirt for her to approve. But her mind was elsewhere, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold sweat forming at the nape of her neck, her grip tightening on the handle of the shopping cart as she fought the urge to look for him again. By the time they reached the fitting rooms, her nerves were frayed. The store had grown quieter, the laughter and chatter replaced by the low hum of background music. She glanced over her shoulder again, praying he had left. But no, he was there, closer now. Standing at the entrance to the fitting rooms, his body half hidden behind a rack of clothes, his eyes fixed on her with that same unnerving intensity. "Mom, can I try these on?" her son asked, holding up a pair of jeans. "Yes, sweetie," she replied, her voice barely hiding the tremor in her throat. She opened the fitting room door and gently ushered him inside. As she stood waiting outside the stall, her eyes kept flicking back to where the man had been, her anxiety growing by the second. But this time, when she looked, he was gone. Relief washed over her, though it felt tentative, fragile. She didn't believe for a second that it was over. Just as she allowed herself to breathe, a shadow passed over her. She glanced toward the entrance of the fitting room area, and her heart dropped. He was back, closer than ever. Standing not 10 feet away, his pale face expressionless, his eyes boring into hers. Fear surged through her, raw and powerful. She turned toward the fitting room door and knocked frantically. "Are you almost done in there, honey?" Her voice cracked slightly, her throat tight with panic. "Almost," her son called back, oblivious to the terror brewing just outside the door. She glanced back toward the man, hoping, praying, that he would disappear again. But no, this time he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching. Minutes passed like hours. Her son finally stepped out of the fitting room, smiling as he modeled the new clothes. "How do I look, Mom?" "You look great," she whispered, trying to smile for him, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. She glanced toward the entrance again. The man was gone. Maybe he had finally lost interest. Maybe she had imagined the whole thing. The store felt quieter now, emptier. She and her son were the only ones left in the fitting room area. Her nerves were still on edge, her body tense, as though expecting something, anything to happen. "We should go," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. She grabbed her son's hand a little too tightly, guiding him toward the exit. Her eyes darted around the store, scanning every shadow, every aisle, but the man was nowhere to be seen. As they hurried toward the mall's exit, the tension in her chest finally began to ease. They passed through the sliding glass doors and out into the cool evening air. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. But then she saw him. Standing in the parking lot, illuminated by the orange glow of the overhead lights, he stood motionless, staring at them from a distance. Her breath hitched in her throat, the panic returning tenfold. He hadn't left. He had followed them outside. Without a word, she grabbed her son's hand and quickened her pace, practically dragging him toward the car. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the nearly empty parking lot as they moved faster and faster. Her son looked up at her, confused. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetie," she lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We just need to get to the car, okay?" They reached the car, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the keys. Her eyes darted back toward the man, but he hadn't moved. He just stood there, in the middle of the parking lot, watching them, his face still expressionless. Finally, she unlocked the car, practically shoving her son into the back seat before jumping in herself. She locked the doors, her hands shaking as she started the engine. With a deep breath, she backed out of the parking spot and sped toward the exit. As they pulled away, she glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. He was still standing there, his figure growing smaller and smaller in the distance. But the feeling of dread, the sensation of being watched, didn't fade. It lingered, clinging to her like a shadow. Somehow she knew this wasn't over. Encounters like this one never truly ended. They left a mark, a scar, that never fully healed. Even as they drove away, the memory of his eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, haunted her. What did he want? Who was he? She didn't know. All she knew was that something had changed that day. And even though she had escaped, part of her felt like she'd never truly be free. The silence in the car was heavy. Her son, finally sensing her fear, sat quietly in the back seat, his small hand gripping the edge of his seatbelt. "Mom, was that man scary?" She swallowed hard, glancing at her son through the rearview mirror. "Yeah, honey, he was." I know what happens when you die. I was 4 when I first saw it. I lived in a fairly safe and comfortable neighborhood. We never wanted for anything, and I was an only child. I had 2 loving parents. By all accounts, there was no real inciting incident. No trauma, no fear, no nothing that would make me hallucinate. I was by all accounts a gifted child who lived with great, loving parents in a large house. I remember I had come home from school, I had gotten a snack from the pantry, and I was taking over the living room to watch Power Rangers, as was my after-school tradition. As I walked into the living room, I looked out into the backyard. At the time, my little brain could only register a furry lump, a squirrel. It hadn't been torn apart or killed by anything, just died of old age. I knew death was a thing, but I had never seen it in real life up to this point. This was the first time it occurred. From the corpse of the squirrel, I saw what looked like stringy tethers break loose from its body. Ethereal blue things, barely thicker than twine, pulling apart as I saw a ghostly blue version of the squirrel emerge from its body. It regarded me for a moment as I watched it. Could it see me? Did the dead watch us? Then I saw it immediately scamper off. My family wasn't religious. I wasn't religious. We were Christian, sure, but we didn't exactly visit church every Sunday. Nor did we avoid specific vices or espout virtues. Still, we believed in the basics. When you die, you go to heaven if you're a good person. Hell if you're a bad person, but at the time I called it heck. Seeing this, well, I didn't know what to do. How was a 4-year-old supposed to handle this? Instead of watching TV, I went to my mom in the office. She was busy on a computer, having a serious talk with someone I didn't know. "And are you sure it's nothing serious? If you, I'll have to call you back. We'll pick this up soon." "Sure. Goodbye." She'd hang up the phone, turning in her chair to look at me. "Yes, Danny?" "Mom, there's a squirrel in the backyard." "I'm sure there is, honey. Is that all you wanted to say?" Mom, I think it died. Her face twisted in a look of revulsion. All right, dear. Let me get Daddy to take care of it. She left the office. I could hear her calling, Jacob? Jacob! Baby needs you to do something for me. She didn't get it. I mean, how could she? What was there to understand? And I didn't exactly blurt out that I saw ghosts. I was 4. What was I supposed to say? So I hid it. I locked it away in my brain, and it was my little secret. In a way, it gave me catharsis. I wasn't having existential dread at the age of 4, but the unknown still scared me. To know that your soul lives on, well, it gave me some measure of peace, even as a child. My parents weren't exactly going to think I was telling the truth either. So why bring it up? Kid me knew grown-ups couldn't see stuff kids could, but it was all right. There was no rule book, but I picked up some things as I watched. Some minor rules. Creatures had to be big enough. A mouse seemed to be the cutoff. I didn't see ants or gnats appear. From death, it took about 40 seconds for something to break free. I didn't know what would happen if you were brought back after legal death, but I assumed your soul was dragged back to you. You didn't get to fly, but you could walk through walls like a ghost most of the time. That was about all I had gathered for about a few years. Things were good for those 2 years. I had my secret nobody else knew, and it gave me peace. I knew one of the great unknowns of humanity. Me, a kid. I felt like a genius. Then the greater truth was revealed. It was December 8th, at about 6:15 in the morning on a Sunday, that things went to hell. I had been dreaming peacefully when the scream woke me up. I bolted upright, almost too afraid to speak. My room was on the second floor of the house and my parents were down the hallway. If I screamed, I'd wake them up. I had nightmares before. Was that all it was? Just a bad dream and a sudden scream? When you're a child, your mind tricks you to justify things. It couldn't trick my eyes, however. Across the street from us was Jeffrey Raymond's. Mr. Raymond's was an old guy, not quite senile, but his best years were behind him. He was a kind man. I loved going to his house when we went trick-or-treating. He liked to boast he gave out full-size candy bars. That made him my favorite neighbor. I got out of my bed to see where the scream had come from, as it had been outside my window and across the street. Was Mr. Raymond's in danger? I didn't know, but I had to look. Mr. Raymond's was entirely blue, just as I had seen other dead things before. But he wasn't acting like himself. He was panicked. He was in his pajamas, howling, screaming, running through walls. He had died, probably from old age, but this wasn't like the squirrels or rabbits I saw. No, he was screeching, sprinting, sometimes going through walls, sometimes hitting them. It's like his body wasn't solid enough. It scared me. I ran down the hall, heavy steps ignoring how early it was, as I'd enter my parents' room. I went to my dad's side of the bed. Dad, I'd say, Dad to Dad. Wake up, can you wake up? He'd groggily groan, leaning over to look at the alarm clock. Hey bud, it's really early. You okay? Nightmare? He'd ask, sitting up from the bed. Mom wouldn't wake up, heavily sleeping. I think something bad happened to Mr. Raymond's. Why so, buddy? Just a bad feeling. Nightmare? No, can you go check on him? Mr. Raymond's might be sleeping. You know he's an old guy, Dad told me. Dad, please, can you please? His eyes said, I'm not going to sleep until I do this, am I? But his face said, anything for you, sport. He'd push himself up, getting his slippers on. All right, I'll go check on him. As Dad went down the stairs, I returned to my room. I'd watch from the second-story window, hearing him open and close the door. Dad waved at a passing jogger, exchanging a quick discussion before he'd walk across the road. All the while, Mr. Raymond's spirit continued to howl, flail, scream. I don't think it knew where it was or what was going on. Dad knocked on the door. Silence. Dad looked concerned for a moment. He knocked again. Silence. Now I think he knew something was wrong. He'd do a quick jog back across to our house, where I heard him in the kitchen grabbing the phone and talking to someone. I hoped to see Mr. Raymond's spirit calm down, but he'd just keep screaming, keep running throughout his rooms and through his walls. There's a danger in nature when an animal gets wounded. It calls for help. Sometimes a kind human finds it and pulls it out of a trap. Other times, a fellow member of the species finds it and saves it. But most often, those cries attract a predator. And in this case, Mr. Raymond's spirit was a siren. I stayed glued to the window, watching the scene, my eyes switching between the actions in the physical world as an ambulance pulled up, and spiritual world, Mr. Raymond's ghost tirelessly howling and scrambling around. I wasn't sure how to help him, so I was going to decide to go to bed. That's when I saw it. All this time I had only seen blue spirits, human, animal, or otherwise. They'd fluctuate in tone and opacity, sure, but always blue. This was the first time I ever saw a red spirit. It scrambled on all fours, long and lanky. Its arms were too long, its legs not ending in feet, but in two sharp talons, one in the front, one in the back. I covered my mouth, watching what I think was its head bob. It had no eyes, a sort of heavy shell covering the top half of its head. It was beelining to the screaming Mr. Raymond. Paramedics were having a polite conversation as it barged through them, phasing like a ghost. One paramedic turned around as if someone had tapped his shoulder, but he looked back to his friend. I saw a primal terror in Mr. Raymond's eyes. He knew this was a predator. He screamed, howling less like a man and more like an animal, before he'd charge into the house. The thing followed soon after. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. Panicked screams, guttural cries, and then silence. Eerily quiet. Maybe Mr. Raymond's had got away? Maybe he went somewhere further into the afterlife. A child struggled to comprehend non-existence, and the universe was now asking a child to comprehend what came even further after. Nausea was going to overtake me before my dad went in my room, making me turn away from the window. Hey, kiddo, hey, Mr. Raymond's, listen, He seemed unsure of how to broach the subject, doubly so considering I somehow knew Mr. Raymond had died. It's okay, Dad, I whispered. I thought it was a nightmare, but bad dreams, I know. Hey, listen, do you want some breakfast? Whatever you want? No, I'm not really hungry right now. But thanks, Dad. I love you lots. Love you too, buddy. Dad closed the door, probably wanting to give me some peace while I processed this. There were things to process, to be sure, but I didn't want to speak on it. I turned back to the window, watching to see if the red thing had gone. It hadn't. The red thing now stood in the middle of the street, hands twitching, hands that ended in knives, not fingers, and it was staring at me without eyes. I covered my mouth in horror. Kid logic said that safety from monsters was always under the blanket. That made sense to me, scrambling under it as I got away from the window. Maybe it hadn't noticed. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Did it want to get me next? Did it want to kill me? The blanket covered me, head to my knees as I hid. I didn't need to see it, I could hear it. The clicking and clacking of its knife fingers on the walls. The red glow as it moved inside my room. I was trapped under my blanket, quivering. And as it came into my room, it just sat there, knees to its chest, right across from me. Time seemed to slow. Did I sit under the blanket for a minute? 20? 2 hours? I don't know. But it wouldn't leave, sitting there watching me. I felt bile well in my throat. I wanted to throw up from panic and dread. Experimentally, and against the child's code of what kept you safe, I removed the blanket. The thing was easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, but its arm length had to be about 8 or more. The shell on its head was more of a carapace, fused to the top of its head like a helmet, leathery red skin, taut and tight, like leather stretched over muscle. The worst was the mouth. It had no lips, no jaws, no normal teeth. What instead I saw was a slowly rotating blender of a hole, sharp and jagged. It was uncanny to feel a stare with no eyes upon you. We locked gazes, or at least I think we did as I trembled in bed. I think I had peed myself, quivering, watching it observe me. It looked back, seemingly unaware of the horror I was in. We were in a stalemate until one long, bony knife finger uncurled. I watched that knife etch into the wall of my room, not damaging the physical space, but doubtlessly marking my room in the spirit world. It read, "Can you see me?" I looked at the wall, then to it, then to the wall. I nodded. Its razor maw rotated, sharp and jagged teeth spinning. "Can you hear me?" it asked. Its voice, guttural, like it came from a drain pipe clogged with muck. I nodded. Of all the words to come out of its mouth, I didn't expect what it said next. Sorry, I didn't want to scare you. Sorry? A monster made of knives and jagged pieces was apologizing for scaring me. Can you hear me? I asked back. Yes. We stared at each other for an uncomfortable amount of time. How did you know I could see you? Your eyes. They're like a lighthouse. When you looked at me, I thought I was in a spotlight. Did you hurt him? I asked bluntly. Did you hurt Mr. Raymonds? Was that his name? It asked. Yes, I did. I'm sorry. Things are different when you cross over. But that doesn't make it right, I'd argue. It looked at me, seeming to finally parse that I was a child, before it'd tilt its head. You will understand in time. What's your name? I shouldn't talk to strangers. I don't want to be a stranger. You're the only voice I've heard since crossing over. It paused, as if trying to figure out how to communicate with a child. Then what's your name? Strangers don't give out their names. I don't have a name, it'd respond. I looked at him. It occurred to me in some childish capacity that not having a name was bad. I looked him over, quivering, ignoring the panic. He might look scary, but he was being too nice, too polite. Just because someone looked horrible didn't mean they couldn't be good. Rocky, I'd say. Your name is Rocky. Why? It asked, tilting its head. Rocky's the Red Ranger. You're red, so you're Rocky. What's the Red Ranger? I stared at him, realizing he probably didn't know much of anything. As an adult, looking back, I realize how idiotic it all is. The juvenile desire to help, ignoring my own safety because I felt I was special. Nothing bad ever happened to special people, spoke the childlike mind. In fact, you can help him, and he won't hurt other people. Evil was a choice, and maybe, just maybe, I could make him something good. Rocky, do you want to be my friend? I asked, oblivious in my youth to how stupid this was, only focused on how I could help him. But you have to promise that you'll be good. I would like that very much. Rocky would make no promise, only that he would like that. Thanks for tuning in to today's horror story. If you have a horror, mystery, or haunting story you'd like to share, send it to us at Urban America Horror. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here waiting for your next horror story.